Hello, everyone. Hi, Janice. Hi, Evan. Hello, audience. Great to see everybody today. We're really excited to welcome a few amazing panelists today and some interesting audience listeners and members to talk about building compensation models. Really exciting topic. I know we're going to have a lot of great content to share. In the meantime, for anyone who is joining, and who has logged in, and our panelists, I encourage you to drop your name where you're viewing from in our chat. And then I have a question if anyone feels up to answer it. This is for our panelists to answer live or for anyone in the chat. What's something you've read lately or a podcast or watched that you think is particularly interesting or relevant to compensation or being in HR or hiring, or just a general recommendation that you have for anyone listening while we're waiting for our last panelist to join?
Yeah, on my side, it would be, I just finished a book called Data Driven HR, and it's all about kind of how to better use analytics in HR leadership. So highly recommend.
Nice. Say the name again.
Data Driven HR.
Data Driven HR. All right. Let's check that one out.
Okay. And for myself, I read books more for fun, not so much HR stuff, but I do listen to some podcasts. So I do listen to the Adam Grant Work Life podcast,
nice.
Which has some really interesting things to hear about in different perspectives.
That's great. That's great.
And there's a bunch of seasons, so you can go all the way back. You could fill up your time very easily.
Love a good season. Love a good season. I was actually talking to our general counsel a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling me that he watches Survivor for the interpersonal relationship building and how to have strategy with different executives, which I found was so fascinating. And I think he might be right. I mean, there's so much there of just kind of jumping in, meeting a group of people and trying to kind of figure out what your role is. And so, yeah, plug for Survivor. I think the 50th season is going to be coming out soon, which makes me feel so old. I mean, I know it's not 50 years, but still 50 seasons feels aggressive.
I also have to just plug the comment in the chat from Allison on Let Them, a Mel Robbins book that is absolutely unbelievable for anybody kind of struggling with letting things go and looking introspectively. It's a really great read.
Nice. Thanks for that, Allison. Well, for those of you who are joining, feel free to drop your name where you're jumping in from in the chat, and then I think we'll go ahead and get started here in another minute. Hi, Laura. Great to see you. Hi. We haven't even started yet. We were just talking books and podcasts and TV shows.
No problem. I couldn't see as easily the join stage button, so I got it. So
no worries. No worries.
I'm happy to connect today.
Amazing. Well, welcome everybody. I first want to say thanks to everyone who's joining the webinar today. And thanks for all of you who are joining, who are introducing yourselves in the chat. I found the chat. I've made a lot of great LinkedIn connections over the past several months of people that have had interesting things to say, and we followed up after. So consider the chat a little micro networking session as well. And now that we're a few minutes past the hour, we can go ahead and just dive right in. So welcome to our event series, HR GameChangers. This is our 10th episode. Yay for number 10. So exciting. And today we're going to be talking about building compensation models and the keys to structure, philosophy, and transparency. And if you have any peers or friends or colleagues that want to come and be a part of this series, we encourage you to share them out the link. I'll drop it in the chat as well. And if you have any questions for our panelists, you can use our chat tool to ask any of those, and we'll make sure we get to them at the end of the session. So with that, I'm going to advance our slides, and there we are. We're going to start off with some introductions. So first and foremost, hello, my name is Janelle Henry, and I am VP of People at RadAI. RadAI is a Series C company that focuses on being that intersection point between healthcare and AI, which is so hot right now, but we're changing and saving lives, which is really amazing through our use of AI. And I've been there for a little over a year, but have about 20 years of experience working in talent recruitment and HR around the Bay Area. And so I'm also a GoProfiles customer. So I also just want to share that we love using GoProfiles. It's been so instrumental for us in our employee recognition. We like to have fun little competitions about how many shout outs people can get. And it's just, I think it's really improved, especially us being a fully remote culture, using a great product like that to help celebrate our wins. So definitely wanted to give them a nice shout out. But let's get to why we're here today. We're here to talk to these amazing panelists, and we're here to talk all about compensation. More importantly, though, how it fits into your values, your structure, and your employee experience, right? Because pay is not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's a message about who we are and what we value and what we want people to feel the value in the work that they do. So with all of that, let us introduce our amazing panelists. So I'm going to ask you all the same question, and we always start the same way. When we introduce you, please share with the audience your first paying job and your most recent job. So Laura, let's kick it over to you.
Okay. So my first job was at a beach grill serving hot dogs and hamburgers down in Ocean City, New Jersey. And where I am now as my current role is the Chief People Officer for Optimizely. I'm based in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. Optimizely is a leader in marketing technology. We're the #1 in the Gartner Magic Quadrant and just recently came above Adobe in terms of our digital experience platform. I've been a Chief People Officer for 5 years almost, and a prior career at SAP and Lockheed Martin.
Amazing. Well, I have a question about your first job. What was the most popular thing on the menu?
I would say chipwiches, if that even is a thing anymore.
What is that?
Many years ago, but who doesn't love a chocolate chip cookie with ice cream and chocolate chips around it? So.
Okay, that sounds amazing. Yes, you're getting me excited for summer with this talk of beach boardwalk food. Well, welcome, Laura. It's great to have you. Let's hand it over to Janice. Janice, great to have you.
Thanks, Janelle. So my first job, I was working in a retail store called The Express. I think it's still around.
Nice.
Yeah. So right now I am a VP of people at a company called Placer.ai. It's foot traffic intelligence. It's a global company. So we have offices all over the, not offices, people all over the world. We are fully remote in the United States. Post Series C, have been a VP or EVP for the last 4 to 5 years. So I've been doing it for quite some time, and then live in New York City. I've been in New York for the last 20 plus years.
Amazing. And New York is in the peak of its amazing weather, right? Isn't this typically the season, the beautiful springtime in New York City?
Well, it hasn't been great,
Oh.
but
Hopefully
it's actually nice today. Yes.
Well, good. Well, it's great to have you. And then last but certainly not least, Evan, it's great to have you.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Evan Salisbury. My first job was bussing tables at the local restaurant in the town I grew up in. And my current job is the VP of Total Rewards and People Operations at Ancestry. We're a family history company. I've been here for about 3.5 years now.
That's amazing. And working at Ancestry, is that, I assume you probably have some perks around getting your own lineage and using your product.
Yes, I've traced my ancestors back to the 1500s, believe it or not, and so I know my lineage all the way back to the 1500s.
It's probably what you all use for your icebreakers too, right? How far back can you trace your family?
Yes, and I can't help but be asked the question every time I say I work at Ancestry. It's like, I know someone who found their distant relative through Ancestry, or found out some great crazy life event from that.
Yeah, it's such a great company. You guys are doing some amazing work there, connecting families back to their past, for sure. Well, great. Well, it's fantastic to have this wonderful panel today. And thank you to those of you who've been dropping info into the chat. Let's move along to the next slide and go over what we're going to be covering today. So today's discussion, I'm really excited about. We're going to be talking about the foundations of compensation structure, how to understand key components of effective salary frameworks, pay bands. We're also going to talk about how you can craft a compensation philosophy. How do you want to take your organization's mission, values, and culture and merge it with a pay strategy? It's most certainly important, ensuring pay equity and transparency. How do leaders find best practices for fostering trust and fairness in compensation communication? We're going to talk a little bit about incorporating market and data trends. How do you leverage benchmarks and analytics to stay competitive? I feel like every day there's a new vendor reaching out saying, I've got a new compensation plan for you, or use this new data set. And so I think our panelists will help us navigate some of those crowded waters. And then we'll talk about how you can scale your compensation model. How do you want to adapt your approach for future growth and diversification? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my my screen here so I can see all of our panelists. There they are. Great. And we're going to go ahead and just jump in to the questions. So the first question that I have is for any of our panelists. What do you think are the key building blocks every organization should establish when creating a compensation structure from scratch?
I can start with that one. So in terms of building blocks, I joined the organization. We're almost 1,600 employees, and I joined 5 years ago almost, and we didn't have the building blocks in place. So worked really hard to be able to put the building blocks in. We're a private equity company, global, around 11 different countries. And as I said, close to 1,600 employees. So a couple of the key building blocks. One is the framework in terms of how do we level organizational jobs. So we're talking about a career framework. Our job architecture is another word that people use for that. So if you have an entry-level role that may be an IC1 compared to a mid-level role that might be IC4, compared to a senior level role, IC6, compared to like roles in the management structure and then an executive structure. So number one is a career level framework. Within that then are certain classifications of jobs within basic categories, whether they're technical jobs or whether they're professional jobs or corporate, and then developing a structure within those roles to have a min, mid, and max within a pay structure. And then obviously tied next to that is each role should have a job profile. And the job profile outlines the role responsibilities, the expectations, the critical skills, the career paths from that role. So those job profiles do serve to be able to have transparency to the employees in terms of how the jobs are framed, which then is a key component to market pricing compared to the job description as well that is then used to source talent as well. So in terms of framework, I'd say job profiles, job architecture are absolutely key to career framework with the salary structure to start.
That's great. And can I ask a follow-up question on that? You know, creating job profiles can feel very ominous and overwhelming, right? Especially if you're joining a new organization and maybe they have something already in place. You know, do you have any tips or tricks or how to even navigate those conversations? Do you suggest doing a little bit bite it off piece by piece, setting aside time to do it right away? You know, would love to hear that because I know that's a common problem many HR leaders have when they join.
Yeah, sure. So it was really an interesting time when I joined. We were on the heels of doing a final proposal for an ERP system. And so you can imagine the time that was spent to build in an infrastructure in an organization, as well as then to move forward with the transformation to move to a global ERP solution. And so part of that was ensuring that we had global job profiles for roles. But in terms of tools to get started, we use Radford. Radford is our salary benchmarking, and Radford has descriptions tied to the roles. It's a great way to get started. In addition, now obviously using AI, job profiles are at people's fingertips now. So in terms of just core areas to get started, I think there's a lot of great tools that have been advanced in terms of this area.
Thanks. Does anyone else have any tips or tricks about how to, kind of set up a framework?
Yeah, I think first off, Laura, what you inherited sounds like you had a lot of fun the first few years.
That's an understatement, right?
I totally agree with everything that Laura said. I think, the angle or the thing that I would add to that is just taking time if you have the time. It sounds like, Laura had to jump right in, taking the time to really understand the business. Where is the business now? Where does it want to grow to? And understand strategically all those things you set up. You're not setting it up for the company you are today. You're setting it up for the company you want to be 5 years from now to put a sustainable structure in place. And so that would be one tip. And then I think just really getting that alignment on the comp philosophy aspect of what is your target market percentile that you want? How heavily do you want to lean into things like pay for performance? And having that alignment at the senior leadership levels of the company is really important as you roll that out. So you're not too far along in the process and then realize that your CEO had a totally different idea of how to attract and retain talent in the most effective way.
Do you think that's something that can be done without building trust first? Right. I mean, because I often know sometimes when you join these, especially some of the smaller companies, they want you to immediately, fix compensation and fix our job profiles, but they also don't know your personal leadership style. Or are you someone that's very frugal, or, there's a money truck that you like to roll out? I'm curious if you all have experience and kind of how to navigate some of those trust metrics, before you jump into some of these conversations.
So I can jump in a little bit here, but I think part of it is just alignment, to make sure everybody's aligned, bring some data to the table. What's the market paying for companies our size that are, with specific skill sets? So again, I think it just starts with alignment, and then you can build it out. It's not everybody's going to agree at the same time.
I think the trust, it takes time to build. I know when I started, I came in to a very different company in terms of the world and size that I lived in for 12 years at SAP compared to, joining a much smaller company, let alone a private equity company. So it was a huge difference. And seeing the relationship with the executive team and really building trust with it, especially my CFO, was critical. Because there were areas that I was suggesting to say, no, we need a compensation framework for a minimum. And we had dialogue to say, well, what happens when you have roles that people are being paid underneath the minimum? And, you have dialogue to say, okay, what about people that are paid above the maximum? How do you transition? And so a lot of great content and a lot of great discussions with the CFO in terms of really building that trust, and then using him as a support to be able to align to the rest of the executive team is important. There's a ton of apprehension when you come into an organization to build job profiles. You're talking about compensation. Compensation is the number one piece where individuals question and have natural concerns around trust, around are they being paid fairly? And so it's really building that trust with the executive leadership, with then building trust with the managers, and then building trust with the employees to indicate what your overall strategy is in terms of what direction, as Evan mentioned, where the company's headed in terms of what roles might have a premium, to be able to determine how those roles need to be paid to be able to achieve the business objectives compared to maybe other roles where there's a broader supply of talent in the market. So really understanding that and then building trust with the employees. I think building a strategy is important, but I definitely agree that trust with the executive team, if they can be executive stakeholders and give the executive backing when the time gets tough, is really necessary, because as you're driving change in an organization, whether it's compensation to align people to a different variable percentage, and if they're like more money tied to base, those conversations take trust and take time. So it's really building your overall strategy and having trust and relationships built with the executives to be backing the decisions that you're asking them to make.
That's great. Yeah, I can recall one of the initial conversations I had with my CEO when I joined was around compensation, and Red AI had been sending out a compensation satisfaction survey to its employees. And I think one of the questions was, do you like your compensation? Which if you don't know that's such a loaded question to ask someone, because, would you like more? It's like, would you like more ice cream? Would you like more of those cookies that you mentioned? Of course, the answer is always yes. Right. And it's also, understanding, right, like I like that point of getting alignment with your CEO or with the executive team, so you can at least be singing out of the same songbook to a certain extent, and then being able to influence. Thank you. Well, next question. So, and I think it's kind of, we're dovetailing right into it. How do you align your compensation philosophy with your company's missions and values, especially when budgets are tight or priorities shift? I loved the head nod to talking with your executive team, but how do you really understand what a company's missions and values are before you start putting ink, pen to paper?
So I would say it's really the total reward strategy. It's not just compensation when you look at it as a whole. And it has to be balanced across multiple different components. You have to adjust it based on the size of the company, the stage of the company, the objectives of the company, the value to employees, and any financial constraints that the company may have. So you have to look into multiple different things going into it. So again, the base salary, and I think one of you had already mentioned, like, is it at the 50th percentile? What percentile are we really targeting to understand for the base salary? What is the market paying? And it's the cost of labor. A lot of people think it's all about inflation, but it's always the cost of labor. What is there? Is there a bonus, a variable component, depending on the job that you're in? How do you look at equity and all other benefits that the company may offer? Is it a 401k matching? Is it just 401k? Is it, travel benefits? What does it look like? So it's all encompassing.
Yeah, for me, like a good pulse check once we have that comp philosophy in place is like, can it continuously act as our North Star as we are faced with, right, a tough business environment, to the point that you raised, Janelle. And then I think it needs to have in it like indexing of what do you actually want to value, and hopefully it would align with your mission as a company, right? And that means valuing performance, potentially valuing something like tenure, or even like smaller things like collaboration or innovation as you think about the type of company you are. And going back to what I was saying about the direction you're moving as a business, like it seems simple when you think about like the basics of a comp philosophy, but the test in my mind of whether it's going to be tried and true is in times of business performance things, and business performance that's not so great, and you're trying to like loop back to that. Does it give you the answer that you need? Does it point you in the right direction to be able to make the right decision for the company? And if not, that's a sign that you might want to revisit that, in my mind.
Thanks. So I have a follow-up question for anyone to answer. Do any of you have a real life example where your comp philosophy helped drive culture or influence a critical business decision?
I think in terms of an example that we implemented in our Vietnam location a longer term retention strategy, and it's a core location for us. And it was based on qualifications in terms of level of role, performance. And I do think it drove a high performance because in order to get a grant, there was eligibility around performance. So I think it hit two key areas in terms of performance as well as retention of our talent, and people felt that they were being invested in for the longer term. We recently then expanded that program to our other key location in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and that program's been widely received.
Yeah, on my side, one that was especially relevant, and especially to your point, Janelle, about the business conditions, by how do you act in times when the business isn't moving in the direction that you want it to. We were recently faced with that kind of towards the end of last year. And we pivoted to our comp philosophy, and embedded in that is this concept of like attracting and retaining the right talent to help us be successful as a company. Everyone's probably heard that ad nauseum at this point. But what we said in that is the right people changes as we evolve as a company. And so when we were faced with this challenge of figuring out how to control our personnel costs heading into 2025, we had to take a look and take a step back and say, well, what is the right people at this point in time, given where we are as a business, given where we want to go to? And we made a decision. Essentially, we had a large portion of our population in San Francisco, which, as I think we all know, is a top compensated geographic region in the US. And we were shutting down our office for 2025 there. We just didn't see traction. We are a remote company. We had an office that we had people voluntarily going to, but nobody was really going. And so what we did is we took a step back and we said, why don't we implement a strategy, a backfill strategy, that as a remote company leverages the fact that we have, a canvas of the entire country to work from to be able to pull talent. So why don't we try to backfill roles and make every effort to backfill roles outside of the high cost of labor areas, in particular San Francisco. And so that's something that we put in at the beginning of this year. And so far we've seen great signs. We haven't really compromised our ability to attract talent. We haven't seen many declines due to compensation in that space. We've been able to save a ton of money. We have effectively controlled our personnel growth curve, which is great. And yeah, TBD on the ultimate outcome, but I just think a great example of how we were able to use our comp philosophy and think creatively in the compensation space to solve a business challenge.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you both for sharing. Now, another follow-up question, and it's a little bit of a question also that someone in the audience asked, which is, how can a clearly articulated compensation philosophy help create a sense of belonging or clarity across the organization? And the question also from the audience that Megan had, which is very similar, is how do you balance transparency with communicating a compensation philosophy to the company? So I'd love to hear from anyone on the panel who has gone either direction, right? Maybe it's gone all in and told everyone, or maybe you've decided to not go all in, and why was that?
Mm-hmm. We're currently working through pay transparency. So I would say it's been a topic of discussion the last 18 months. I would indicate that we had to put in the framework, as I mentioned, for a couple years to be able to get in the min and mid and max salary ranges, as well as the leveling, get everybody aligned to the right job. We had several acquisitions as well, so once you have that framework in place, it was like, okay, then let's work towards pay transparency. And so we then also put in part of this decision was to ensure we had bonus targets that were aligned to the correct levels. The lower the role, the lower the variable target, whereas the role is more senior, there is a natural element of risk. When you're a senior director or a VP, you have a much higher leverage in terms of the percentage of your base salary. So that was important to be able to get into and adopted before we became pay transparent. So we're not pay transparent yet, but we're actively working towards that. We're evaluating if we do shift our base pay ranges to total target cash ranges to be able to have a more effective conversation in the event that we do become transparent, because the bonus as a percentage is a core element of people's compensation. And we may have individuals that have a higher leverage, but have a lower base salary. But when you add up the totality of it, they are more in market and have more equitable point of view in terms of where they are in the salary range compared to individuals that maybe have a higher base salary and little on the bonus. Sitting them against the total target cash range is a little bit difficult. So we're always kind of having discussions around this, and it's definitely an area of interest that I want to move forward. I came from a pay transparent organization, and I was there when I was at SAP. We made that change. It was a big change. I don't think it's anything that we can't do. I think it's just making sure that the fundamentals are in place so we can continue to build trust with the organization. And there is also a level of maturity that the managers need to be able to have those conversations where individuals are against the pay range. If somebody is lower in the range, it's because they are a lower performer or they don't have the necessary skills yet. Or if somebody is higher in the salary range, that might be a realistic conversation to say, you're reaching the cap of what we want to pay for this role. And that's a very difficult conversation when you have a top performer. But I do believe there is a market value of a role, and just like you would have in your own home hiring help, and there's a certain market value that you're going to pay. Of course, you're going to pay the best for the best, but eventually there's only so much that you're going to pay for somebody to paint your house, because that's the job value worth of a painter. So I think it's looking at manager maturity and then understanding, where we are in terms of the fundamentals to help you build that infrastructure. I think one of the worst things that you can do is go out to be pay transparent and not be ready to have those conversations. So it's a building block. We need to sort of think through that journey. So very, very timely conversation for us.
I definitely want to hear from others on this answer, because I think it's a great question, but I want to double click on something Laura said. We were having that same challenge at Red AI for sure, with managers not feeling like they owned compensation. And I had so many people on their teams come to me as the head of HR saying, my manager said I should come talk to you because I don't like my compensation, or they didn't hire me. I wasn't the person that that was here when I started. And so they said, it's your job to explain to me how we landed on this number. And I just had to call timeout. And so a couple of months ago, actually, we did an entire session to talk to our managers about how to talk about compensation. And we said, guess what? You own this. You may not have decided on it. You may not like the range. You may not like this. You might have gone higher or lower, but this is your problem. This is our problem collectively. And that has made a tremendous amount of difference. So Laura, I just want to say that out loud. Great call out on bringing managers in. Janice, Evan, any thoughts on how you handle this, I think, very meaty topic of transparency?
So we aren't fully transparent yet, but I fully agree with Laura. First of all, it really has to start. One, we have to have the philosophy, but really training the managers. Because I agree, they come to you and saying, this person wants an increase. They said they're paid too low. They're looking at Glassdoor. They're looking at this. They're looking at that. And I'm like, okay, but those aren't the right places to look at. That's one piece of a metric you can look at, but it's not everything. And really trying to explain, this is where we get it from. We're really trying to compare multiple different things. Again, company size, stage of the company, any financial constraints we may have. So again, looking at all of that stuff, it's just not one thing that you see online.
Yeah, I think it's all great answers. The one thing I would just add to that is the way that I think of it is as a spectrum, right? From zero transparency all the way to there's a list with everyone's salary in the company and anyone could just look up the salary, right? And hopefully, I don't know how many times that's been done successfully, but understanding where you are and where you want to be. I think I came into essentially no transparency and was trying to get to a place where everyone understood their band and where they were in the band. That's, the first step. We're not quite there yet, but we're making strides in the right direction. The one thing I'd want to say is, like, as it relates to communicating your compensation philosophies, in our head, the way we thought about the journey, that was the first step. Going from zero to where we want to get to, putting on our company intranet site our compensation philosophies and principles, and being as transparent about why the decisions are made, how the manager is involved in the decisions, going back to Janelle, what you were talking about. It just allowed us to start that conversation and to make the employee feel like, oh, this isn't shrouded in mystery anymore. I can go online and learn a little bit more about how decisions are made in the compensation world. And so that's been really effective for us, answering the cost of living question that we've gotten 100 times of why doesn't my pay go up with commensurate with cost of living.
Yeah. And I think it's, for those of us who have, post roles in California, right, all of your jobs have to have a range. Yeah. And that always brings up, I think, a lot of big feelings as I tell my 9-year-old, because you have people on the team who maybe they joined 3 or 4 years ago and they were paid very heavily in equity. And now they're seeing a salary on a website that's not what they're making. And I think it brings up a lot of, trust issues. I think just as important in talking to the manager community, it's setting expectations with the larger company that people are going to be paid different things. And while we will always ensure there is no bias in how we pay, not everyone's going to make the same thing, right? You and this other person may be doing the same job, but maybe they do it much better. And so they get, right, a bonus, or they receive a higher review score. I think that's what is really hard to communicate to people, because I think this term of pay equity is out there now, and people, say, well, I should get paid what this person gets paid. But there is, a degree of variance here. We have another follow-up question that I wanted to ask the group. And I think it's on the same topic. So let's say you have an underpaid employee. And so we've gone through, the process of reviewing our pay bands. How do you handle the pay compression, right? When you see people within your own company that aren't making what they should? Any real life advice or examples on what you all have done when you found situations where people are not making what they should?
So I think if they're not within the range, if that's what the person means, I think you can, depending how far off they are, if it's just 5% increase, maybe it's doable right away. If it's a significant increase, then maybe it's baby steps, a couple times during the year, or say, once you do this. So again, it really depends how far off they are within the range. And again, are they doing the same role for that range? You have to look at a bunch of different things.
Yeah, I would say not to be afraid of doing an off-cycle increase during the year. When you get an annual budget of 3%, 4%, whatever it is in the tool, you're not going to solve pay discrepancy issues with that budget. So they have to be solved outside of the cycle. And I think it's our role in HR to identify where there could be some pay discrepancies and be an advocate to fix those. Naturally, it's not a black and white, and it's a lot of just variation within the pay decisions. So I think it's flagging and using data to identify a cohort of people that could be potentially underpaid. In HR, we don't know the ins and outs of what's behind the performance rating. There's a wide level of meets in an organization. People barely got to meets, and there's people that are really busting it in the meets, but they're not, and exceeds. So in terms of that variation, you do have to have those conversations with managers and understand, but I definitely would encourage people to call it out and flag it for a conversation. Managers are very, very busy. They're sometimes don't see what we see. Not to say HR isn't busy, but I think they do appreciate that consultation and bringing data to the table to have a discussion. And I think it would be remiss of us within HR if we don't have a conversation, discussion of individuals that could be seen as an anomaly. Because there are some people that do get lost, unfortunately, or they don't have the advocacy skills that they need to have a conversation with their manager, or there could be some bias in the system. So having that ability to raise it and discuss it is really important.
Yeah, I would just add one thing quick is just, I totally agree. Procuring a budget, procuring a dedicated budget to handle those situations is a really important aspect. And then the way we handle it, thinking about that question that came up in the chat of, do you just get them to the minimum, or do you do it with compression? The way we think about it is we'll do both calculations. So we'll say, what's the cost to bring everyone to the minimum? Mm-hmm. What's the cost to do it with compression? And then that kind of sets your field goal posts of what can you actually afford is the ultimate question from a business perspective. But it allows you to kind of hone in on what's the minimum to get everyone to the range, and then what's to do this the right way and adjust for compression. Oftentimes it's a lot more money. You might not have that money, but if you have that conversation with a dedicated budget, it's a lot easier.
Yeah, kudos to the budget for sure. And I think sometimes in smaller organizations where HR and talent are even more connected, I think it's a great thing, because if you can give an org leader the ability to own a budget, they can start making some decisions on their own of whether they would like to overcompensate the people on their existing team, or whether they would like to hire new people to offset those costs. And so I also think it's a plug for anyone who's trying to think about distancing HR from the recruitment side of the house. I think the more you can bring them together, so you think about that as one pool of money, is really valuable. And we also, noticed even within Rad AI when I joined, that there were people who in their compensation negotiations opted to take more equity rather than base, right? And so if you don't keep good records of kind of why these decisions were made, you'll get into a situation and you'll look and you'll say, wow, why is Joe's compensation so low and his equity is so high? And your first instinct might be, well, we need to modify that. Well, no, Joe made a choice. And so again, I think it's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. I think it's kind of understanding the why and the clicks along the way that got us to this point. Now, you can't always do that when you become a company of, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000. But I think as you're starting out, if you're starting to make some unique comp choices, my recommendation for people in the audience is document how they got hired and why you went with those. On the other side of that coin, so talking about people who are compensated too low, Allison had a question about how do you deal with people when you're going through this kind of change management, grandfathering of levels and comp with inflated titles, or who are paid over their level. Would love to hear from the group on that.
Yeah, so we definitely had a lot of issues when we were doing the mapping, because people get tied to a title. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with my CEO. I've worked with my CEO for over 10 years because I worked with him at SAP. And we've had, it's almost like job security for HR, because we've had so many conversations around people's titles, and it's actually sometimes exhausting. So I think, don't be afraid to make some hard decisions. I think getting the CEO support or CFO support to back you to say, look, this is what it looks like. We have individuals that are using an AVP title, and the CEO indicates that we don't want an AVP because we feel comfortable with a VP and an SVP and an EVP. We don't need an AVP if it's somewhat similar to a senior director. So let's eliminate the AVP title. And sure, it sounds good on paper, but when you get to the point of having that conversation with an individual, it's like, yes, I understand that your role you believe is titled to the AVP, and I understand that you're now going to be called a senior director, and that is the reality. And this is why we're making that change, because we're simplifying, our structure, or we're ensuring that people have a more clear career path between levels, whatever the rationale may be. But having that CEO to back that and say, like, the reality, this is how that conversation is going to play out. Are you prepared to handle that reaction? Can you support me when this escalates? And so I think, building that trust earlier is what we talked about. So in terms of getting alignment on key decisions, I think is important. Don't be afraid to make them. I think at the second time, there are some situations where an individual should be grandfathered, and if you could get into a conversation in terms of different role changes or organizational changes that are no fault of their own. An individual's moved into a new team, and you still want to retain the individual, and you decide to grandfather that individual with the bonus target that they had for the 12 months until you can bring it into alignment to everybody else or what have you. There are one-offs, and that's why compensation is really an art, not a science. So these are difficult conversations, but I think you need to really think through them and understand the impact. Then understand, is this precedent setting? Because if so, then you really need to understand and hold your gun together, or your firmness, right? Because if not, you're going to unravel. And that moment of weakness is when it's all going to fall apart. So really make sure you know what you're doing. Think about the impact that it is. Again, if it's precedent setting or not, you need to feel comfortable and put your head at night on your pillow that you're doing the right thing. So, really, really think about that. And that's where I think as HR professionals, we have a lot of internal ethic requirements to be able to do this role, because you should have a fair pay practice. And that's the definition of fair. Are you making exceptions for one person in terms of the grandfathering? At some kinds, it does make sense. But is that the norm? Can you differentiate? Can you defend that? That's where you need to really be thinking through that.
Yeah, for us, we haven't really been able to change some titles because, again, people maybe were here when the company started. They became a VP, 3 years in. It's very hard to take that back now. But something we did roll out when we rolled out the leveling, and some people don't know their levels, is behind the scenes is sort of how we figured out the pay based on the role and responsibilities and looking at that. I do think rolling out the titles to say these are our titles going forward, this is what's helpful. So taking it forward is where we'll make some changes. I had somebody today saying, I think I want somebody as a head up. I'm like, are they managing people? Because head up is managing people. If not, this is what I presented, a couple months ago. These are the titles. So if we can pick one of these, that would be more preferable.
Yeah, the title struggle is real for sure. And I love kind of ignoring the comp piece of it, because honestly, that's your comp, right? It's what you've been given. It's not a situation where we will take it away, but I think the expectations of what you're doing need to match the title of the job that you're doing. And it might take a while to get there. And to your point, Janice, right? You might be a VP of a 20-person company, and that might mean answering the front desk calls and ordering, Ubers. But in 5 years, if you're now that same title and you've got, 400 people underneath you, your role has changed, right? And so you need to be living up to what that new title means. And I think that's where, goal setting and setting, making sure that managers are setting accurate, KPIs for people to handle so that they can actually live up to that title. Because it might evolve, right? What meant senior 2 years ago might now be different. So I think it just makes the value of what we're doing so important. Want to ask a question from the audience before we get to a couple more. So Devyani asked a question that they have some knee-jerk reactions when managers have a flight risk. So especially when, so I guess his question is kind of focused around when someone claims says, I'm going to leave, or I'm not happy, you should compensate me more. managers often are the first ones to say, we've got to keep this person, what can we do? How do you all handle that kind of knee-jerk reaction from either individual managers or maybe even the executives themselves around how do you, pay for performance and not pay when someone's threatening to leave?
Yeah, I could start with this one. We deal with this a decent amount, and I think it was a bit of the Wild West when I started, like with no clear guidelines around it. And so I think the first thing that I did is just try to understand, like, what do we have anything currently in place that would be a policy, guidelines, and guardrails around what we can do? The answer was no, and so you put those in place, like dive and save, battlefield promotions, like all these terms, like what can we do to make sure that we're doing this consistently? And so I do think some of the things we considered in the policy is like, do we do a dive and save and right for someone who's meets expectations? Or do we only do it for someone who's exceeds expectations, like the higher performance ratings? And that was a question that we asked. We landed on exceeds only. And then the second question we asked was, right, do we do it for, do we do promotions as a part of the save, or do we only say compensation is the only thing on the table? And we landed on promotions would be on the table in that situation with a variety of approvals. And so getting a consistent framework, in my mind, is like the right approach. So you can say, and then getting the approval of, even the CEO on that, you can say, here's what we do. And
Sure.
within the guidelines and guardrails of what is actually permissible. And you could land with, some people take the approach of, absolutely not. We don't do any of this, right? And it makes it super simple, super clear. If someone says they're leaving, and unless you give me more money, it's sorry, we don't do that.
Yeah, I tend to find in these conversations, there's often more behind the compensation. So I will use consulting skills to really dive in deep and help to understand what is the issue. Oftentimes, individuals that are unhappy with their role, whether it's, the amount of responsibility they have, or they're frustrated in these 4 processes that are weighing them down, that it just becomes like icing on the cake in terms of what is the
Sure.
piece that like really tipped them over in terms of like, hey, I'm done. But I literally have 5, 6 reasons why. And then people will say, oh, I'm taking another job because it pays better. But in reality, if you think about, well, why was the person looking for another job, or why did they take the phone call in the first place? Most of the times it's where there's frustration at work to say, you know what, I'm kind of done. I want to go do something else, or this isn't worth it for everything I'm put up with because I'm not paid enough. So I think it's trying to uncover more on the psychology around it. I do think I've seen cases where it is, yes, someone literally is happy and they just feel underpaid and they're going to jump for something more. Well, if we believe that that person has potential at the organization to do more, and we think that the person could be underpaid, and then I would say, hey, take a look at that if there's budget available, right? But in other cases, if it's a culmination of things, like what somebody might stay for another year until they get the next headhunter call to be able to go for another 10, 20% increase, like you're not going to retain that person long-term anyway. There has to be a connection with the individual in terms of feeling part, that they want to make the company win and succeed. And people exhibit that interest and that engagement from a wide variety of behaviors. So you'll see that, but again, there are a handful of people that sometimes they do slip through the cracks. And if they're your next successor, the amount of increase that you want to give them is less than what it would take to replace and then train and have that effect in terms of the true longer term cost. That's something you need to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because often I've told hiring managers and executives that compensation is sort of the least personal way to tell someone you're not interested in a role, right? It's much harder to say, I don't like you as a manager, or I don't believe in this company anymore, or I just have a whole laundry list of things that will make you really upset. You just say compensation, right? It's more money. And I think it's our job, like to your point, Laura, to help kind of dig in and double click a few layers down, because that data is very valuable. And maybe it is compensation, but it might also be the fact that they're just not meshing with the company anymore. And they don't really want to have that conversation with someone who might take offense to that, or potentially write their next recommendation, right? You want to leave on good terms, and money kind of feels very, clean, right? It's pretty binary. Couple more questions here. So this was a live audience question as well. So for companies operating in multiple markets with a varied cost of living, how do you balance pay equity with geographic compensation differences?
I think it gets back to the philosophy. So we're in 11 different countries, and you have the compensation philosophy with where you want to pay and range. And so each country has a different salary structure, and the company philosophy is pinning where you're going to pay in that range. Is it based on performance? Is it based on critical skills? Is it based on internal equity? So I think you have to look at a couple of the different factors in terms of identifying that. But the market drives the salary range. So the ranges itself, there should be equity within the country. You don't take an India salary range and compare it to the US in terms of the positioning within the range. That's where it should be globally consistent as much as possible. It's never going to be a science.
Sure.
But how do you sort of have those key principles? Managers have global teams. So you have a manager of 8 people who has 3 people in London and 2 in Sweden and 5 in, or 4 or 5, whatever, in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Like, consistently, that manager has to use the same philosophy in terms of how they want to reward their team, as I said, based on performance or critical skills.
Yep, I agree. Each country or even state, city, it's very different. And again, if you're looking at different countries, there's different health benefits, there's pensions in certain countries, depending on the role. So again, it all plays into the total rewards.
Yeah, the last thing I'd say on that one is just the concept of not applying just a broad-based differential. Within the US, we do it, and I think it makes a lot of sense. But outside the US, it's important for all the reasons that I think Laura was mentioning about the nuances of the particular countries to get country-specific data and to be using salary guidelines, targeting the same market percentile that you do in the US to have that global comp philosophy. But creating those guidelines with country-specific data is a really important aspect of creating the equity that you ultimately want to create, which is paying that market percentile for the talent.
Great. Thank you. All right, my last question for this group. You guys have been a fantastic panel so far in our audience. So many great questions. So we only got through about half of what we had here because the discussion was so good. But I'd love to leave everyone on a little bit of advice note of our last question. So what is one piece of advice you'd give an organization or leader for anyone who's striving to build a fair and motivating compensation strategy? What would be your soundbite, your takeaway?
I would say be in alignment with your leadership, because at the end of the day, in HR, our role is to offer support. We are not decision makers. Your role is to influence the business. And so you need to have that trust and be able to effectively influence. At the same time, you can't get your feathers all frazzled if the business doesn't accept your proposal.
Yeah.
So it's learning to balance that. There are times when the business will listen, and there's times where they won't. And there's times that that's okay, and there's times where that's not okay. And so learning that agility and that flexibility, diplomacy, I think is really important as you align with leadership on that. Because if not, if you're going to get so frustrated, like they didn't listen to me, or this is how it has to be. I mean, it's just not going to work. But at the same time, you can't be a pushover.
Yeah.
I'm just like, oh, that's what you want. Okay, sure. Sure, no problem. Like literally stop and understand what you're doing. And I think that's where the alignment with leadership goes.
Thanks.
I agree. It is alignment. It's defining the goals. It's defining the philosophy, everything that we spoke about before. And then it's communicate and implement it, understanding that we can always tweak it. We can always change it. It's not something that's going to be here for the next 5 years. It would be great if it is, but if we need to change it based on the company, the financial state, the values, we can go ahead and change it.
Yeah, it sounds like Laura stole both of our answers, Janice, but it is the right answer. And I think that's probably the absolute most important thing. The one thing I'd add on is how you show up to that moment, right? And having the right data, being able to communicate the ROI, being able to get the buy-in, ensure the highest probability of getting that buy-in. To Laura's point, I would just add in, like, it's a really important moment in the evolution of your compensation philosophies and ultimately your structure.
Amazing. Those were great answers. Thank you so much. So, all right, I'm going to pop back open our discussion points. We went through our Q&A. And so I want to say thank you again to our panelists and remind anyone who's listening today that we have a few more amazing sessions coming up this summer. So our next session in July will be the future of HR leadership. We're going to talk to some amazing folks talking about architects, how to architect a CHRO strategy. Then in August, we will talk about the path to CHRO, how you can brand strategies internally and externally. And then September, we will have HR Crossroads. So we will balance AI and people-centric organizations, which I know, I feel like that's the soup du jour. It's the topic of the day. How do we balance people and AI in a very people-heavy role? So with that, I want to say thank you so much to GoLinks and our sponsors today for bringing all of us together, having us learn, having us network, having us connect. I also dropped the link to GoProfiles in the chat so you can join us again in the future. And thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Evan, Janice, and Laura. And thank you to our audience. I hope you enjoyed this session, and we'll see you for session 11. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.